What's the most messed up thing you've seen at a funeral? My grandfather was an identical twin. When Gramps and our family walked into his brother's funeral, it became very clear, very quickly, that not all of the friends of the deceased knew this. The joke my uncle made at my dad's funeral. He walks in to make a speech and the first thing that he said was, "Well, I've waited 52 years to say this, but I'm now the number one son." It was horrible, yet one of the funniest things I've heard. About 2 weeks ago my grandpa's funeral happened to take place on my birthday. I wasn't too bitter about the date arrangement. That is until my aunt announced in the middle of the funeral that we should all sing happy birthday to me. So to list it all out, dead grandpa in the room, everybody standing around teary-eyed, funeral choir song just finished, and now everybody is being led by my crazy aunt in the most confused and out of place rendition of happy birthday ever sung. Not my attendants, but my roommate's. His aunt had a stillborn baby, so he and his wife attended the funeral. The parents planned to release a bunch of butterflies from a box as a spiritual symbol of sorts, but forgot to poke holes in the box prior. There was absolute shocked silence as the parents dumped a box of dead butterflies on the floor, and my roommate had to leave the church to cry from laughing so hard. My childhood best friend died earlier this year. We lost touch in our teens, and he apparently changed a lot in the intervening 15 to 20 years. He got into a lot of drugs and eventually wound up choking to death on his own vomit as his druggy friends watched. The funeral home did a slideshow of photos of him. Every single photo showed him getting high, being stoned, drunk, or wearing Gigolo makeup. When his mom gave his eulogy, she proclaimed herself a Gigolo in his honor. My completely estranged father showed up 20 years after swearing he'd never see any of his family ever again at my grandfather's funeral. He then asked me to step into the hall with him during my grandfather's benediction prayer, where it turned out he had asked the funeral director to remove me from the property. The family had no idea this had happened until 10 minutes later, at which point everyone left my grandfather's funeral in disgust. While they did their best to console me, my father took advantage of the lack of people around my grandmother, and he tried to talk her into moving into a home and to sign the family properties into his name. She broke her hand hitting him. This wasn't the least bit fucked up to me, but I can see how some might think so. My parents' retirement jobs were /are at a local funeral home. My mom loved to gamble. I'm pretty sure she still had dad running for scratch-offs and lotto tickets till the day she died. A big joke at the funeral home was how my mom would play Frogger at lunchtime to get to a place across a major busy road that had scratch-offs. When she died, the funeral directors pitched in and bought 100 scratch-offs to hand out to guests. Instead of a moment of silence, we had a moment of scratching. It was awesome. My stepbrother had an infant that died, and at the funeral they passed the baby around like it was still alive. Most people held it, and basically the whole duration of the funeral it was out of its coffin. I personally think that's pretty weird, but maybe that's just me. My friend hanged himself, and there is no way that Orthodox priest would hold requiem for person who killed himself because it's against church beliefs or something. We are at the funeral, dead silence, and priest is nearby, comes to brother of the deceased friend and says, "There will be no requiem for suicide deaths, but if you can pay up, maybe we can work something out." Sure, priest, come right behind this small chapel to give it to you. And he and his two brothers beat the shit out of the priest, face swollen. The man was moaning, everything. Priest comes back and holds requiem. For free. For sinner. Not technically at the funeral, but it affected it. My aunt stole the money intended for my grandmother's headstone, her own mother, and ran away with it before the funeral, so my grandmother just had a wooden cross marking her grave. No one in my family has seen or heard from my aunt since. Well, apparently taking selfies with the corpse is a thing. On my grandfather's funeral, a friend of my mother's came over to her, hugged her and said, "Congratulations. Congratulations. I'm so happy for you," in a very sad voice. This friend fell from his balcony a few months earlier and didn't recover completely, so he always mixed up words or expressions. We didn't think it was possible, but we laughed so much that moment, leaving this poor soul confused about our amusement. My mom's dad was an asshole. Straight up wife beater. 3 daughters hated him and all ran away at 14. Never bothered to meet my sister and I, his only grandkids. On several occasions told my mother to abort me and boycotted my parents' wedding. I didn't care when he died, as I'd never met him and only knew he wasn't a nice man, but his funeral was one of the most hilarious days of my life. Short summary, only 8 people showed, my family of 4, my aunt and uncle, and the widow and her friend. There weren't even enough people to carry the casket, so we had to borrow men from another funeral service to help. No one had told the funeral director I was in a wheelchair following surgery, or that my sister was 11 and couldn't be expected to help. I tripped an 85-year-old WI veteran. Being a military funeral, there was a flag ceremony from the local legion. Being in a wheelchair, they parked me right up front, but angled my leg directly into the aisle of the church. Dad parked me next to the open casket and locked my chair brakes on purpose, leaving me inches from grandpa's corpse for about 20 minutes until he stopped laughing and freed me. The eulogy, the piece de resistance. Our priest was a lovely man, but had never met the deceased. No one volunteered to read any eulogies from the family, no friends had attended, and the priest knew we were basically only doing the bare minimum out of obligations to the widow. He read a beautiful excerpt from the Bible, and basically told us all he's with God now. It is no longer our place to judge him. Judgment from God will do the rest. My great aunt and uncle owned a funeral home, and my mother worked there for a bit as mortician/funeral director. One weekend, she couldn't find a babysitter, so I rode along with her to help with the funeral stuff. En route to the cemetery, one of our police escorts for the funeral procession was hit by a car running a red light. He died. Didn't see this personally, but my friend returned from her grandfather's funeral pale and shaken. As they were lowering the coffin into the grave, one of the straps snapped, one end of the coffin dropped hard into the grave, broke open. Corpse half rolled out. Grandmother started screaming. Father started crying. She said it was the grimmest thing that's ever happened to her. Not me, but the guy with the glasses, who did all the Verizon commercials. Can you hear me now? From a couple years ago, Paul Marcarelli. He was interviewed by Time and said this. In the interview, Marcarelli says he had to stop wearing thick-rimmed Buddy Holly style glasses to avoid attention, and at his grandmother's funeral he could hear someone whisper, "Can you hear me now?" as the casket was lowered into the ground. Pretty bad, however I can't stop laughing at it. The evangelical pastor first said that he normally didn't do services for people who commit suicide, then at the end of the eulogy, asked for a show of hands of people he'd converted during the service. A friend of mine was shot and killed when he was 17. At the funeral, a lot of his classmates showed up wearing things that said he was an angel, and one girl had "Corey is my guardian angel" painted on her rear window. There were 2 pastors at the service. The first one, my old pastor, gave a heartfelt service about him, and, since he knew almost everyone in town, was able to help the family grieve afterward. The other pastor, from a newish church in town, went up to the podium and spent the next 15 minutes ranting about evil teenagers and complaining that high schoolers don't realize that you don't become an angel when you die. I saw it written on one of your cars that he's your guardian angel as I was walking in. Well, you're wrong. When you die, you go to heaven or hell, and the way the youth in this town live, I'll be surprised if I ever encounter him again in this life or the next. Implying he was heaven bound, while the deceased boy beside him was going to hell. Even if you believe that, don't fucking say it at the funeral in front of the guy's mourning family and friends. His church wasn't open for much longer after that. I think the building was repurposed as a garage or something. My mom works in the funeral business. Sometimes I would come to work with her and help her set up the chapel for a service. One service in particular was of a little boy who drowned. His parents dressed his identical twin brother in the same outfit as him. Grief does shit to you. At my mother's memorial service, my dad had several members of his church come up and speak. My mom was not a member of this church. In fact, she was agnostic. We let him do it anyway, as I felt it comforted him. Anyway, one of the guys proceeded to tell us that we were all going to burn in hell if we didn't repent, just like my mom. A couple I knew received word to rush to side of the husband's father as his death is imminent. They do, but since they know a large inheritance is due, They stop at the BMW dealership to order a new car. Flash forward a few days to the funeral. Just after the funeral, the husband is publicly berating his mother about how he needs the money as the car is being delivered. The entire time, his wife is egging him on to get the money. He finally tells her she must write a check to cover the costs, and that it is her fault that he is in this position. This all occurs within 20 minutes of her having to bury her husband of more than 50 years. After the first check comes in, they are very pleased with themselves, as this is the first time he has ever had his own money. Well, technically, it was just outside of the funeral. It was the wake for my family member who had been killed by an iPhone robber as he fled the scene. It was highly publicized in the area and news cameras had been there, etc. As the wake was winding down, I began making trips to my car in the funeral home parking lot. First, I brought out my purse and a few boards of family photos, then some plants and flowers. During one of my trips to the car, I had forgotten to lock the doors back up, and I found my purse had been tossed out onto the floor. What was stolen? My iPod Touch and cash-filled cards. That someone literally stalked me at a funeral in order to rob me in the funeral home parking lot is the most fucked up thing I've ever seen at a funeral. I went to a funeral of a Haitian guy I knew. Throughout the funeral, random Haitian women would start screaming and often had to be restrained. Also, this guy was notorious for cheating on his wife, and several of the women he had sex with came up to speak while his wife and kids were right in front of them. My late cousin's brother launching into a diatribe about her alcoholism during the eulogy. She was beaten to death and her body dumped near an overpass by some guy she worked with who had a record of violence and had raped some other woman at gunpoint several years ago. Alcohol had nothing to do with it. My mom and sister and I walked out at that. There were also local news cameras at the funeral and it just felt so wrong. Honors detail for a deceased service member. As a member of the firing party for the 21 gun salute in a bad area. On the first volley, the younger family members actually leap over the chairs and start running and hollering. This of course distraught the other family members even worse. I will never forget that scene. I mean, what the fuck did you think we were going to do with the rifles? The most fucked up funeral I have been was for my grandfather. He died after a brief battle with cancer. Anyways, I tracked to his home state with my parents, brother, and husband to the funeral. We did the vigil the night before the actual funeral. All is okay. Emotions were heavy partially due to me being 7 months pregnant. The next day was the funeral, and we are dressed in our best. We get to the funeral home, and we are escorted to the family area. From there, we saw other family members showed up in hunting gear, cute tofty shirts, and overalls. Okay, whatever. Then their friend who is / was priest starts the funeral, and for over an hour, he rants about the government system and the evils of mankind. This was during the election race of 2012, and kept making allusions to the end of times in the presidential race. He kept going on, that the Antichrist is in the Oval Office, etc. He not once mentioned anything about my grandfather's life. After it was over, we went to the car and sat in silence before my brother asked, "What the fuck just happened?" My time to shine. So when my alcoholic, druggy grandmother passed, the funeral was uncomfortable at best. Notable occurrences included my grandfather telling the priest that they were still married. Spoiler, they hadn't been together since the 60s. And my uncle singing "Ding Ding the Witch is Dead" over and over. But the worst moment by far had to have been when the priest asked us to say nice things about my grandmother. My 11-year-old raises her hand and says grandma was naughty. She used to shoot cats in the backyard. And people laughed at that. I went to a funeral when I was 6 and saw a woman barf in the open casket. I don't remember anything else, but I got in trouble for laughing. The fuck did I know? My grandmother's aunt died. Open casket for some mysterious fucking reason. Grandma got up in the middle of the service to fix auntie's wig, which she then somehow pulled off, so she picked it up and fluffed it, kinda like a pillow, and rearranged it on auntie's corpse. It was horrible.